Hi, it's Kirby. Today is May 18th. It's Saturday. I hope you guys are looking forward to beginning your weekend as a good one. And if you've already begun your weekend, I hope it's enjoyable. So, I've been going down a lot of rabbit holes, and I'm sure many of you have heard about Gary Webb. Gary Webb is in the same vein as Danny Castellero, and he basically became known for his exposure in the San Jose Mercury News of the so-called crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. And basically, that was connected to Iran-Contra, and which he claimed originated from CIA. Now, initially, when he did this in his series, Dark Alliance, and I'm going to actually pull up the entire series. I believe it's either here already, but you may not find it, so I'll just pull it up again. All of the major newspapers came out and started to discredit him. What few people don't know about Gary Webb is that and I have said this about Danny Castellero, is that had they continued their research, and in fact, they did, and then their lives abruptly ended. It is my belief, looking at the information I've uncovered, that they would have connected eventually to Leslie Wexner, Jeffrey Epstein, human trafficking, and other nefarious activities that were being conducted through, let's say, members of the CIA, so on and so forth. What a lot of people don't know about Webb, well, before I say anything more, I just want to say that he died on December 10th, 2004. And this was on a day that he was moving out of his home. He had begun his move. I believe he was going to stay temporarily at his mother's house. And, there were boxes packed in his apartment, in his house, sorry. And then out of nowhere, he supposedly commits suicide with 2 bullets. Well, there was someone who became president of the United States just a month before. So on November the 2nd of 2004, 1 month before the death of Gary Webb, President George W. Bush was elected to the presidency. The investigation that Webb was carrying out, in addition to Danny Castellero, would have led them to the Bush family and to Clinton and to other, I'm going to call, shadowy figures of this cartel, of which Wexner and Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and Leon Black are a part of. And so I had always been suspicious of the so-called suicide of Webb, as I have always been suspicious of the suicide of Castellero, right? And at this point, I'm almost sure that when George W. Bush became the president, that it had something to do with the sudden demise of Gary Webb. Webb did a lot more before he wrote the Dark Alliance series, which came out in 1996. He'd also been a reporter in Ohio. And while in Ohio, he discovered some odd things that were happening at Ohio State University, which, as most of you know, now has Wexner's name as part of its title, and which has also been connected to another major scandal. He had been working on some other tangents from the Ohio State University when one of the coroners that he was talking to basically gave him a tip and said, hey, why don't you look into a doctor by the name of Michael Swango? And this guy was a blonde, blue-eyed paramedic who the coroner believed had poisoned half a dozen of his colleagues at an ambulance company after being kicked out of Ohio State University's medical school. And then, he added that, Swango had offered coffee and donuts to his co-workers, and all of them had experienced a lot of pain. They had nausea, they were dizzy, and then, so they were like, Webb began investigating this guy Swango, and suspected that he had killed several patients at the medical school's hospital. But he also discovered that instead of telling anyone, this is Ohio State University. It's not just where Wexner went to school, it's where Meshulam Riklis went to school, and a lot of the other people connected to this nexus went to school, that the school basically just covered it up in order to, quote, avoid bad publicity and lawsuits from the families of the patients who had died. And so this guy, so this guy eventually gets convicted of 7 counts of aggravated battery for poisoning his colleagues. And he spent 5 years in a prison in Illinois. And then he changed his name. He bounced around the country under a fake name. And there were dead bodies of patients, wherever he was working. However, nobody stopped him. He then found, he went to Africa. He found a job at a clinic. He was arrested in 1997 during another flight from Africa to Saudi Arabia that made a stop in Chicago. And then there was a trial in 2000 when a Virginia jury sentenced Swango to life in prison for fatally poisoning 3 patients years earlier at that location. So Webb was, investigating this guy. And, I don't think many people are aware of this. Later, after there was another investigation, now it just seems that this guy, Michael Swango, was, quote, a protected individual. He was born on October 21st, 1954. He is now known as, quote, a serial killer physician who is believed to have killed as many as 60 people by poisoning them. And it's not just the patients, he poisoned some of his colleagues as well. In 2000, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. And then, basically he's serving his sentence at a place called ADX Florence because he was in the prison that he was at before because of his heinous crimes. He had been attacked by another prisoner. So he was born in Tacoma, Washington. Tacoma, Washington is interesting because that is where Michael Riconosciuto and his father, both agents of 3-letter agencies, were born and where they lived. He was raised in Illinois. He was the middle child. His father was in the United States Army, who served in the Vietnam War. And basically, he was a big-time officer because his name appears in the who's who of the government's database between 1972 and 1973. And then, like when he returned from war in Vietnam, that's when he and his wife divorced. And Swango apparently didn't see a lot of his father. And he went to an all-boys Catholic school, graduating in 1972. Swango himself served in the Marine Corps, and he didn't see any action overseas, but he got really interested into like exercise and just just doing odd things. And that's basically when he decided to go to medical school, which he did at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. And then like he did display troubling behavior during the time that he was in his school. He apparently had a very high IQ, which appears to be the norm when we start studying these serial murderers. And then he decided that he preferred to work as an ambulance attendant rather than continue his school. And then he had a fascination with people who were dying, so that the patients who were near death, he was just by their bed. He was really hyper focused. It's almost very Jimmy Savile like. We know about Jimmy Savile having interactions with corpses, right? And by the way, I've gotten some more information on Jimmy Savile that I will be uploading here on this platform that links him to other things that he has not been linked to before. So keep an eye out for that. I'm working on that. So when people started noticing his murders, he was already like in Ohio State by 1983. And that's really when Gary Webb kind of heard about this guy. The nurses who were not, let's say, protected, there seems to be some connection between Ohio State University, which is now called Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. There seems to be a connection to intelligence between this university. And so but the people, not everybody who's working there obviously is an intelligence asset. And so some of the nurses noticed that healthy patients began to die at an alarmingly fast rate. Healthy, they were not seriously ill. And every time one of these patients died, it was Swango who had been the intern for the floor. And then one of the nurses caught him injecting medicine into a patient. Medicine that was wasn't on his chart. It didn't have to be given to him. And then right after that, he became very, very sick. And so these nurses did report their concerns to administrators, but they were accused of being paranoid. Clearly, the nurses were women. And in order to discredit women, women have historically been labeled as paranoid, right? Oh, it's just a paranoid woman. And then people just gloss right over it. The information doesn't even reach them because paranoia has been used to discredit not only women primarily, but children as well. All right. So then in 1984, Swango returned and started working again as an emergency medical technician, even though he had already been fired for having done something like that. And even before the patient arrived at the hospital, the patient, became strangely ill. But a lot of the paramedics on staff working alongside of him noticed that whenever he was around or whenever he brought coffee or food, a lot of them became seriously ill. And, these are healthy people that are young and they're working just with him and accepting your coworker brings you some coffee, you're going to have a donut or you're going to have a pastry and you eat this and you don't think that it's poisoned. Usually it's one person that you're working with that contributes, and most of us don't think twice when something like that happens. And so, but they started to get suspicious. And so then in October of that same year, he was arrested after arsenic and other poisons were found in his possession. So he was basically poisoning the food with arsenic, right? So then he was convicted of aggravated battery for poisoning his coworkers and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. So then, once that happened, the stuff that happened at Ohio State University resurfaced, right? So then the dean of the school, who at the time was a guy by the name of James Meeks, decided that the hospital should have called the police and also told the media that there were a lot of, quote, glaring shortcomings in their initial investigation of Swango. Even though he said that it would take another decade before OSU finally conceded that it should have, quote, brought in outside investigators. So then, you're not going to believe this, but even after all of this and Ohio State University being put on the carpet by many people, and even after it was clear that this guy had been killing people, they decided that they were not going to bring charges against him because they didn't have sufficient evidence. I would think that dead bodies are sufficient evidence, but what do I know? So like he was released from prison in 1989, and then he worked as a counselor, ugh, at a developmental center in Newport News, Virginia. And then he was forced out after he was caught like creating a scrapbook of disasters on, quote, work time. So it would have been okay for them to see that this guy had a macabre interest in like dead bodies and natural disasters that killed people if he did it in his spare time. But they caught him doing it while he was at work, and he was a lab technician and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, they decided that they were going to just fire him for doing this on the job. So he married a woman in 1991. She was a nurse at a hospital by the name of Riverside, and he was employed at the same place uh, until he resigned to then become a doctor somewhere else. He then changed his name legally to Daniel J. Adams, and he tried to apply for a residency position at the Ohio Valley Medical Center in West Virginia. In 1992, he started to work at Sanford Medical Center in South Dakota. And in both cases, to apply for both of these jobs, he forged a lot of legal documents stating that he was a doctor, which he wasn't, and that he was a respected member of society. He forged another document stating that he didn't have a criminal record, despite the fact that he had been in jail, and despite the fact that it had already been exposed that he had a felony of poisoning his coworkers. He continued to sort of like pull off a really, weird thing. He was able to get a job. He continued to report people around him continued to report that they were sick. They didn't feel well after he was around, whatever it was that he was giving them. They were getting sick, and he left. So like he leaves Stony Brook University, and then he starts working at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in New York. And then once again, the patients start dying for no reason. Otherwise healthy patients who were there just for routine stuff began to die. And then Someone else was declared a suicide. However, when they did an autopsy, they found that she had arsenic in her body. Now, remember, he had been found with arsenic on his person, and that's kind of like his modus operandi. So it was just surprising to everyone, including the family members of the people who had been hearing about this stuff, to like realize that how does somebody like this guy Swango continue to work at all of these medical institutions? How come he was allowed to continue on this killing spree? So um finally in 1997, while he was traveling from one place to another, again, trying to change what he was doing to another location, he was arrested. Again, that was in June of 1997. And then, although the FBI and the Veterans Affairs and prosecutors for the Eastern District of New York were convinced he was a serial killer, they too thought it was, quote, difficult to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. And so they kind of knew that if they couldn't convict him, he would kill again. The government then tried to get a dossier of the crimes that he was alleged to have been guilty of. And then as part of the investigation, what they did what they should have done many years earlier. They began to exhume the bodies of 3 patients that died mysteriously while he was taking care of them. And they found that in one of the patients, he paralyzed him with an injection, which was supposed to have been a sedative, but the sedative, in quotes, basically caused the patient to fall into a coma, and then he died. And then, of course, they continued to discover that he had been lying about things, checking the records of the patients, claiming that maybe one victim had a heart failure, or basically he had injected this other victim with potassium that stopped her heart, so that it mimicked a heart, like a heart attack. And we know from the 1975 Church Committee hearings that CIA had ways of mimicking a heart attack. So a lot of this stuff that happens here, and again, Gary Webb was working on this story, which is not known to anyone. But we do know that CIA is fond of using things that mimic a heart attack. And a lot of the things in this story smell to me like he was part of some bigger experiment, because we know, for example, that somebody like Charles Manson was very likely an MK Ultra project, I'm going to call it. And it just seems to me that this guy Swango was also someone who is part of a sub-project that no one has probably ever looked into, creating a mass murderer. And he, again, like, he rarely changed the way that he killed people. And so with people who weren't who were not in the hospital setting, like his coworkers, he used poisons, and usually it was arsenic. He slipped them into food. Now, slipping something into somebody's food and or drink is another tactic employed by CIA, which is why they used magicians. There's a very famous magician who I've spoken about, whose name I can't remember right now. who the CIA employed to teach them how to surreptitiously slip something into somebody's drink. So once again, something like this, which is what he was doing, smacks of like a CIA covert operation conducted through this serial murderer. Well, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this one, and let me know if you had heard that Gary Webb was working on other stories that were never revealed. And I believe that, again, it's because they were all connected to the same place, right? To the intelligence faction. All right, guys, have a good day. Give this a like. Bye.